Okay, hello. Welcome to another podcast. Today we have a guest from the Alhambra City, part of the Planning Commission. But before I do that, real quick, I just would like to remind people just to like and subscribe if you like what we're doing here. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our guest, Ron Sahu. Is that correct? Just want to double
Yes.
check. Ron Sahu is a 32-year resident of the Alhambra area, and he lives here with his wife and getting his Masters and Ph.D. from Caltech in the late 80s. He is an engineer, environmental and energy consultant by profession, and he's a member of the Grassroots Alhambra organization and currently part of the board there. And he's strong. And I asked Ron to be on here because I wanted to take a deeper dive on Measure V. So is there anything I missed there, Ron?
No, that was good, Bryan.
Okay. So I just want to just start off a little bit. So what got you into the position you have in the city of Alhambra?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on your podcast, Bryan. As you said in the intro, I've lived here really all my life after graduating from graduate school, and raised our family here, our kids here. And so we have been involved in small ways with sort of issues that affect, ordinarily as citizens, you're not really aware of City Hall and all its impacts on your life. And my first involvement with what I would call loosely community issues happened, almost 10, 15 years ago when there is a small park. Our city is relatively poor in park space, in open space, given the density and the number of folks who live here. And we have near our house a small park called Story Park.
Right.
And there was a plan about, I forget the exact time, but well over 10 years ago when we became aware at the last minute that somebody was planning to build some condominiums on that park space. As I said, we have very few parks. And that got us thinking about, that didn't seem right. We thought we should actually have more park space, not less. And we talked to neighbors, we meaning me and my wife, and we talked to the greater neighborhood, and we actually were successful in that effort to get the then city council to see that didn't make any sense, and they decided that they would withdraw, that project went nowhere. So that was my first sort of involvement in community issues, and really was a positive experience in the sense that, that the council at that time was able to take public input, which was pretty strongly against this proposal. And so they went along with that. And then fast forward to maybe 5 years ago, Mr. Eric Sonata, who's a community member, he ran for office, one of the city council seats. It was a hard-fought election. He didn't raise a lot of money, and compared to his opponent, and yet he lost, but by very few votes. And it became pretty apparent that it wasn't really a battle of ideas or policies. It became one of pure sort of money. If you had more money, you were able to send more mailers. You're able to kind of do the things that money would let you do in a city of our size, which is about 90,000 residents and about 40,000 registered voters. Reaching everybody by walking is not an option anymore. So people have to raise a lot of money to just get the word out that they're running, whether it's yard signs, whether it is mailers, whether it is door hangers, those sorts of things. We obviously don't have a local press that covers our city too well. We, at least at that time, didn't. And it got me thinking, and got a lot of others who were a little bit involved in Eric's campaign thinking of how, whether or not this type of organization and way that we elect our representatives makes sense, whether it is allowing for a proper debate of actual ideas and policies, or
Mhm.
whether that is getting hijacked purely and becoming really kind of a money issue. He or she who raises the most money wins, regardless of ideas.
Yeah, and going back to that, I've had Eric Sonata on this program twice already, and we did mention that, during his campaign it was, you know yeah, it's true. As much as it was a battle of ideas, it was also a battle of the wallet, almost, that his opponent raised more in special interest dollars than he could in his grassroots. But what you mentioned earlier is that, the margin in which he lost, maybe there is a shift and an understanding that, money shouldn't necessarily be the basis of politics, especially in the local level. um and I think this is what I find Measure V very interesting, even though I'm not in the city of Alhambra, or like, I'm kind of like Alhambra adjacent. It's just that, this has kind of a greater, larger kind of implication that, money shouldn't be part of politics. And, I think the hope for Measure V is to get community members more engaged in politics and in the decisions that the cities would make. Do you think I'm going about it in the correct way? Am I missing any points when it comes to this idea of campaign finance reform?
No, you're not, Brian. That is actually a central goal of Measure V, is exactly like you said. In cities like ours, where politics has not been about the parties, it's been, these are nonpartisan races, right? We don't really vote for city council members, whether they're Democrats or Republicans or independents. It's
Mm-hmm.
more about, at this level, about ideas, right? About the basic bread and butter of, you know, local government, things like development and traffic, and whether, our sewer fees are okay, whether our water fees are proper, whether the city is being managed financially properly, whether we have allocated our budget properly. Those sorts of bread and butter local governance issues have never been about partisan issues, but it is still about ideas, and that's
Mm-hmm.
exactly right. And the more we analyzed Eric's loss and few things that happened after that, it became sort of apparent to us that there were sort of two threads. I mean, while campaign finance reform has, in a general sense, a lot of support. I mean, everybody, when you pose the question, should this question you just raised, Brian, is, should money dictate, should the wallet overcome ideas? Most people would sort of say, no, it shouldn't. You should have a level playing field for money. And so that part, I think, was not very difficult when we just even informally talked to people about campaign finance reform as a concept. The question is how to design one while we still have to be mindful of some things. Number one, whether you like it or not, or people who you might not like their views, everybody has a right to participate in the political process, right? I mean, everybody has a right. This is not about excluding anybody, but it has to be done with a level playing field. That's what it is. Number two is, as a city with campaign finance reform, we can only do so much, meaning we still have to follow the laws of the United States, the Supreme Court decisions. In other words, we can't just make campaign finance reform in our city in a way that we can even overcome those guardrails that are imposed on us by federal laws, by
Mm-hmm.
Supreme Court decisions. So we have to stay within that. And so what we started thinking about is, how do we go about getting meaningful campaign finance reform while not being able to change the things we can't, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what is under our control, how do we design that? And that led us to a thinking that we cannot at the same time ask that there be some limits on, let's say, donations. So I know our Measure V has $250 per person, as that's defined in state law. Anybody can donate up to $250, and whether you're a business, whether you're whoever, resident, you can do that. But we still recognize that to run a election in a city as big as Alhambra with, as I said, 40,000 voters, 90,000 people, races were taking somewhere between 40, 50, 60, $70,000 to run in the aggregate by the time you look at the costs of a campaign. So we said, okay, on the one hand, if you cut the amount of money people can donate, maximize it at this $250, now you're asking a candidate to run citywide, limited in how much money they can raise from per person, and yet they still have to raise this huge amount of money because nobody realistically can walk around the city and get to know their neighbors and do all that in a limited period of time. So that led us to thinking that how have other cities in California managed this process, cities of our size? And we found out that most of them have by district voting. In other words, they don't have at-large voting, which we have, and even this election will be at large. If Measure V passes, then the next elections will not. But they've managed it by doing by district voting, which is now you have districts, so the people are elected from their own districts. And Alhambra had the advantage that we already had district boundaries drawn in the past. We were already have 5 districts and roughly equal population, about 7,000-8,000 registered voters in each. And that then makes it manageable. If you have to run in your own district, you can raise money. Even if you're limiting it to $250, you can, even if you don't raise that much money, you can realistically in 6 months go knocking on doors or go to small gatherings and and sort of get your message across. So the wallet advantage diminishes. Now it becomes a race of ideas. So that was one thread that told us that in addition to campaign finance reform, for it to really work, we also need to go to a by-district system of voting that the other cities of our size have. And then as those conversations happened, Bryan, we became aware, talking to others, that our at-large system might frankly be illegal from a California Voting Rights Act and Federal Voting Rights Act perspective. And that's another sort of angle that we initially were not thinking about. But when we did the research and looked at the demographics and looked at the last many elections of how people have been elected, and our community is not the same as it was in the 50s. We have had a lot of Latinos, and then now we have a lot of Asians, and so the demographics is quite different than, let's say, decades past. And there were real experts who looked at this and said, you have a problem with the Voting Rights Act, and your at-large system is not legal. And so that sort of those two threads came together. In other words, on the one hand, we were thinking about by-district voting to make campaign finance reform meaningful. And I'll get into that more in the discussion, hopefully. But at the same time, we also had this idea that other cities were flipping to by-district simply because they were in violation of Voting Rights Act. So both of those concepts got incorporated as sort of the primary pillars of Measure V, in addition to transparency and a few other things that we sort of looked at other models, what sort of best of other models that cities had in their election charters. So that's kind of gives you an idea how we came about that.
Okay. Yeah. So I had this notion that like the call for Measure V was just on a dollar basis, and I didn't realize it was also how the election can be conducted. And I think I got a little bit of a sense of that. It did kind of I wouldn't say confuse me. I don't know if I was ever explained correctly what like what was the verses of by district voting like.
Yeah, but right now we have what's called an at-large voting.
At-large voting model.
Yeah, it's by district at-large. That means I am in District 1 in Alhambra, but I get to vote for 5 of my council members, even the ones that don't live in my district. And that means each Alhambra voter theoretically has the ability to vote for all 5 of the election of their council members. By district would limit that to the person that represents your district alone. And we'll see, while it might seem on paper like, wow, that's unfair, that you're taking people's ability to vote away, they have 4 extra votes they won't have in the future. It turns out that having those 4 extra votes for people who are not in your district is actually illegal under the Voting Rights Act. So we are trying to get that message across that having one accountable council person, and I'll explain what that means, is really better than having this ability to vote for 5 people when none of the 5 people are accountable to you.
Yeah.
In other words, it's a question of accountability that will actually be strengthened by having a by-district vote and people in a district voting for their representative, who they can hold responsible, who will be more responsive to them, and who ultimately will look to them to get reelected again.
Yeah.
And that was not happening. What was happening, Bryan, is some of our council members have gotten elected using votes from other districts, even though they lost in their own district. So they were not, because they had to run citywide, they were not as responsive to just the voters in their own district, because they said, well, if people in my own district don't like me, I can always go get votes in other parts of the city. And so there was that voter dilution occurring, which really means that accountability, between each district's voters and its representative was lost. And that we want to bring back. We think that's the root of some of our governance problems, about dissatisfaction with development or sustainable development, dissatisfaction with traffic issues, parking issues, lack of park space issues, noise and pollution issues, which are things that you would run immediately to your own representative and say, hey, what's going on here? And when people did that, they were sometimes given the cold shoulder. They were saying, well, go to some other council person. You got 5 of us. So it's like being married to 5 people. It doesn't always work. I think you have to be kind of one-to-one.
Yeah, it's not indicative of a representative government. And I'm starting to get this more now, is that like if I were a district person and I lent on the votes of another district, like that, I'm not representing my district. I'm representing somebody else's district and their ideas of how to run a city. And so like I think it's not just campaign finance reform. I think it's like just voting and like how elections run. I think it's like a full I wouldn't say indictment, but a full like reimagining of what the voting system would be for Alhambra, in Alhambra's case, because it sounds like there's a lot of cities that already done this reform.
Yeah, and I need to stress that point, which is, you're exactly right. It is a rethinking of what would work best, but it's not a new experiment, because others have come to the same conclusion. In other words, the fact of having by-district voting is not like a one-off idea that has never been tried before. It's a leap into the future. That's actually the opposite. We found 9 out of 12 cities of our size in California were already by district. Even local other cities, Monterey Park was going to go by district. The Alhambra Unified School District is going by district. The idea of, as you said, Bryan, it is a question of how you run your elections to bring accountability and representation to your representative, which was getting lost. And one of the factors that was causing that detachment between voters in a district and their representative was very simple, which goes back to campaign finance reform. So I'm sorry, because both of these are inextricably tied, the campaign finance reform and the way in which we elect our representatives. You'll see for a reason. So come back to the idea that it was taking, for a successful city council campaign, $60,000, $80,000, give or take. Eric only raised less than $20,000. His opponent raised almost 5 times, and Eric lost by literally a few hundred votes. Okay, but it takes, our elections have run 60,000, 40,000, 80,000, somewhere like that. So if I am running for council, and now I am going to raise that kind of money, just as a practical matter, sure, I can go to my friends and neighbors and have my block parties and raise, at $50 a clip or $20 a clip, I can raise what I can. But it becomes easier to go to somebody that has real money and say, can you write me a $2,500 check? Can you write me a $5,000 check? And I can much more quickly raise $50,000 talking to 10 people who will give me $5,000 apiece than to take the trouble of connecting with 1,000 of my fellow citizens to get that kind of money, right? So it becomes, as a practical necessity, this idea that I have to cater to and listen to the people who have the really big bucks, that they can then simply donate to me. And of course, when they do, when they come before my council, they have business before my council, there is some expectations that I'm going to come back and help them. They helped me get elected. I have an obligation. So we were seeing that happen. Now, people on council will say, no, we don't care about people who donated to us. We are able to keep that separate in our heads. But as a human being, as somebody who has gone, and it's common sense tells you that kind of separation doesn't always happen. And it's certainly hard to explain to the public that, hey, Bryan Kim is a big developer and he gave me $5,000. And then next thing he knows, he's coming for a variance for his big project. And I'm simply going to not think about the fact that Bryan gave me money and I'm going to make an independent decision. It usually doesn't work that way. It just simply doesn't. And even if it did, it leaves a cloud of suspicion in the minds of the public. Are you really being responsive to voters or to the people that elected you? And so by going by district, by having campaign finance reform, we want people in the future hopefully won't have to go to get those $5,000 or $10,000 donations. They can raise the small monies required to run in a district and get it through the small donors. So they are beholden to their own citizens, as opposed to somebody who has big interest. I'm not saying by any means that we don't want responsible development in the city, but it levels the playing field. In other words, when they have business before us, our council members in the future will not have to worry about, making those judgment calls as to, gosh, they're a big donor, and what do I do? On the one hand, citizens don't want this. On the other hand, my donor wants this. That type of a dilemma will be avoided because you don't have to rely on them. We should be relying on our own fellow voters and citizens to elect us, and that's what we want to have happen with Measure B.
Yeah, I feel like I have a notion or a feeling that, like, given how like the national elections are right now and how it's politicized as who's donating X amount of money to one candidate or another. It's like the Democrat get $150 million from Silicon Valley. What does that mean? And it's and this is something that where if you hear the kind of that slogan on the news that take the money out of politics, this is what we mean. It's not just the money. It's about who's being represented behind that money, or how much a person that wants to be in a public forum, like how much their decisions are tied towards the community versus a person that paid X amount of dollars to their campaign.
And that's exactly right. But then I'm sure we'll get into that, and I hope we do later on in the podcast. But it also is true that when you have an entrenched system like we did, and it creates its own vested interest, right? People have, and I don't want to cast aspersions on anyone. We're all Alhambrans. We all love our city. We all have a right. That doesn't mean we have the same opinion. Heck, I disagree with my wife half the time. Having different opinions is just part of who we are as Americans. So it's not about that. But what we have had is the system has worked, let's put it that way, for a relatively small number of people who either have been involved, they've been in office before, or they have people as they leave office, they have their chosen appointees who take their place, and they kind of move fluidly between the centers of power in the city, whether it's city council or school district and the various commissions. And it becomes kind of a system that works. I mean, they become familiar with it, and therefore they see no reason to change it because after all, it is working. So we wanted, I personally, and people in Grassroots, and we're very widely represented. We have about only 300-400 people in the city, and it's a diverse group of people. We happen to think that our greatest strength in the city, and it sounds like a cliche, Bryan, but our greatest strength in the city is the fact that we do have 90,000 people with great, amazing life stories and great skill sets who are not participating in that whole democratic process, right? For whatever reason or the other, they're kind of standing outside the glass looking in, right? Where decisions are being made for them. whether it affects, and then it kind of breeds a little bit of cynicism, like, oh, whatever I do, it's not going to work anyway. Why bother, right? And so unless you have something happening literally at your doorstep, like somebody's building something and you lost your parking space, or there's noise because some construction started at 3 a.m, you don't interact with City Hall, right? You kind of keep that to a minimum. You try to avoid your parking tickets and traffic tickets, and you kind of go about your life keeping your, kind of keeping your head down and kind of, but yet you have great skills. You may be a planner somewhere. You may have accounting experience. You may have amazing sort of professional background that we could all benefit from if you played a role in this great American experiment, right? In how we govern ourselves. And it might seem like a cliche and highfalutin, but it's particularly important. And I'm an immigrant, first generation immigrant, and we have tons of those in Alhambra. And the idea that we can all play a role, we can all bring to the table our experience, and that richness of experience and decision making was being lost. When the same 5 people make the same decisions over and over again, they're in an echo chamber. New people were not getting an input. And we are hoping that by increasing accountability, more people will run for city council, because now they can see that they don't have to raise 60 grand. They can run it with 10 grand, or they can just walk the streets and talk to their neighbors, right? They can run it like Eric's campaign did. So we are hoping it encourages that kind of participative democracy, because it reduces the bar for running for office. It reduces that, that threshold, that hurdle you have to jump over and say, oh my gosh, I can't. How am I going to raise that kind of money? And, this is a non-starter. It'll give people ideas. So we're really hoping that is that will reinvigorate. And I think we'll all benefit from that. I mean, even during the campaign here we've met people in the city who are like, wow, you've all this amazing skill set here. We had no idea. You know what I'm saying? Why don't you participate in our, Historic Preservation Commission, or in our Transportation Commission, or in our Parks and Recreation Commission? We need people with new, fresh ideas. And this is not about just ideas. You're actually professionals in that area. You actually have great contributions you could make. So I'm hoping that it does that, Bryan, as a benefit to how we elect our representatives.
And given all that and the conversation from Measure V, what are some of the people trying to say no for this proposition? Who are the individuals that say the status quo is the best, the model that we have at the moment, therefore we should not and shall not change campaign finance reform? So what's the movement currently right now to say, hey, we don't need this change?
That's a very good question, and I think it deserves some. So, but to give you a little background to answer the question, I have to take you back a little step of how Measure V came to be. Okay.
Yes, please.
So, and that will it'll be a longer answer, but you need your readers, your listeners need to rather hear that to make sense of what I'm about to say. So, when Grassroots Alhambra, and we formed a sister entity called Grassroots Alhambra in Action, which was a C4 entity that could actually bring this to fruition. The first step to changing the city charter, which is what needed to be done to make these campaign finance reform and by district elections a reality. We didn't want to leave it to just getting a vote in city council, because that can be reversed by a future city council. So we wanted to make a change in the charter of the city. And to make a change in this charter of the city requires essentially putting something on a ballot. At that point, it was not called Measure V, it was just called a ballot measure. And we had to raise signatures. We had to essentially get signatures from 15% of the registered voters in the city, or something like that. Okay. And I told you we had like 40,000 registered voters. Whether they vote or not, that's the number of registered voters. So we had well over, something like 6,500, I forget the exact number, valid signatures to be collected. And that process is very tightly governed. By the time you put out the ballot measure text, get it approved by the county, you get kind of a start date to go, and then you only have 6 months to get all that. Okay, so you have to work furiously to get that. And you usually want more, because some people don't sign exactly the right way, and those have to be verified. You don't want to undertake the effort and then lose, and because you have slightly fewer signatures than you need to be valid. So we went through that process in 2018. We drafted a language. It had to go through county and make sure that the ballot language is okay and all the formatting was okay. And then we started collecting signatures, our citizen volunteers. And we realized quickly that we needed help. We needed, signature gatherers to help us, just like we do for all of our state initiatives and other initiatives. And that's a way in which you can get signatures. And we had to pay our signature gatherers, okay? No question. So it was a combination of our volunteers and signature gatherers that we paid for that collected a little over 8,500 signatures, something like that, and that we submitted to the county. County said you have more than enough required. So indeed, you now have a ballot measure that can be put on the ballot. It's up to the city council when they will put it up and so on. So we went to the city council, Grassroots Alhambra, and said, we have this ballot measure. Now it's certified. Now, it has to go on the ballot. They all agreed that it'll go on this November 2020 ballot. Okay, so that was the first easy decision made back in 2018. And then we said, if city council wants to negotiate with us, and we can even tweak this ballot that we just want to put and make it a unified measure with the approval of city council, then let's go hand in hand together and get this thing done, okay? And have a unity measure. Well, after some negotiation, it didn't work. City council at that time had two representatives who tried to work with us, but we couldn't reach terms. So we said, okay, well, we'll just, we'll deal with it. That was back in 2018. So we said, fine, as we get closer to the election, we'll see whether there's interest in doing something together or not. We left it at that. Not much happened in 2019. And when 2019 came around, it got closer to this election. This was also pre-pandemic. We started saying, okay, let's get going here. Let's get the machinery moving here for this ballot measure, because there's some official paperwork that has to be done. It has to be submitted by the city attorney to the county, and we have to get this measure letter designation and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. During that process, we had been doing research about this whole thread that I told you earlier about the Voting Rights Act, itself being a potential issue because of the at-large elections. And so without going into every sort of play-by-play detail, we were able to convince city council that it is in everybody's interest to have a unified ballot measure that would go on the ballot. All 5 city council members approved it. The city attorney, wrote the required language in our sample ballot that we get from the county. And we put this on the ballot with really no known opposition. And that's an important thing. So as part of the process, anybody could have opposed the ballot measure then and got to say in the sample ballot, why they don't like it, then we could rebut and they could rebut us. And so the voter has that whole back and forth, right? When they're getting ready to do their research, who's for it, who's against it, what the argument for is, what the argument against it, and the rebuttals. When you look at a sample ballot, there's no argument against it at all. The two entities that are for it are the entire City Council of Alhambra, number one, and then Grassroots and its all other endorsers. And we have, by the way, about 25 endorsers. People like the League of Women Voters, people like the Asian American sort of organizations in town, people like the Democratic Club in Alhambra, and so on and so forth. A lot of organizations and good government organizations signed on. They read the ballot, they understood the context, and they signed on as endorsers. But nobody really, at that point, opposed this. So when the sample ballots were printed, it was all only for, nothing against. Mm-hmm. So we were coasting along. Our first sign that some people were going to oppose this came only about a month ago. And so we found some yard signs that popped up that said, don't take our voting rights away. And, and it was paid for by a group called Friends of Alhambra. Took us a little while to figure out who was behind this. We had our suspicions, but it was some people who are involved in current city government and have been in the past. Mm-hmm. They have donated, and what I have to make it clear: they have every right to oppose. I mean, this is their right to oppose, and we wish it had been done in a much more upfront way in terms of the actual transparent sort of way. But nonetheless, so they are one group that have opposed this, mainly on the grounds, if we can understand the argument, that it comes back to, we have the right to vote for 5 people now, why are you taking this away and having it limited to 1 vote only? That's what the argument is about taking away the voter rights. Mm-hmm. And we keep saying that, yes, it's nice to have the right to vote for 5 people, but it's not a right if it's illegal, okay? I mean, it's
Yeah.
like saying I have the right to rob a bank and don't take that away from me. But if it's illegal, it's illegal. I can't do it. Okay.
Hmm.
And well, the city actually got threatened that unless they change, they're going to file, they're going to have a lawsuit. That's in part what got city council members to sign on. They saw the merits, but they also recognized there was a legal threat that if they didn't go to by district, then the city was facing a ruinous lawsuit. And our city attorney, who's by no means a grassroots member, I mean, he's a professional there, he advised them that this is a real threat. And similar lawsuits have been won in almost every city that has faced that, and they have converted. So based on all that, that we end up with by district. But this particular group seems to think that we're taking their rights away, or Measure V will take the rights away. They're not fully understanding the increased accountability to your own council member, all the arguments we just discussed earlier. Then they have other arguments. They have some personal attacks. I, as an individual, donated a fair amount of money to help with the signature gathering because we didn't, and that takes money. We paid people living wage, and we we got things. So somehow it's become a negative that we had to pay people to gather signatures. Well, I'm not sure much can be done about it because we had a limited time to gather lots of signatures. And right. That we can't multiply ourselves and be everywhere. And while we had our own volunteers, we needed that help. But that to me is a process issue. I mean, hopefully people can see that. Let's focus on the merits of this, how we got here. If there was a cheaper way, we could have done it, believe me. But there are implications that somehow people that donated to that process somehow have a hidden agenda. Our position is no hidden agenda. Our agenda is pretty clear. It's actually laid out. We want campaign finance reform by district voting. And none of us that have donated have any business before the city. We are not developers. We are not asking for special favors. We don't make a living working for the city. There's no private gain involved. But those are the two main threads, which is somehow we're taking people's rights away. And the fact that, some of us that are involved somehow have some reason to alter this so it would be to our benefit. As far as we can guess, those are I hate to make the other side's argument for them, but it's important to appreciate where people are coming from. And I think that's where they're coming from.
Yeah. And I think that that's a good thing for for democracy. It's like the discourse between, what's the benefits, what's the cons, what is the other side is saying versus what your platform is saying. Like there was something earlier where it's like I was having a conversation with a friend about a proposition in California, and I'm very for it. Yeah, more voting rights for people of the age of high school. That's one of the propositions here in California. But like they brought up an argument saying well, there's not a system in place to educate people at that age, for voting rights. And so I was like thinking clearly, it's like, okay, maybe, but still, like I already voted, but still, it's just not considering like a broader lens. That's the whole point of democracy. It's like understanding what you're voting for and having an informed knowledge of what you're voting for.
We couldn't agree more, Brian. We want this to be about exactly the ideas of why our system in Measure V, if it passes, will be a better system. And we are happy to be challenged on those issues. In other words, tell us more why you think it'll be better. There are some people who are afraid of change in general. That's understandable as a human level, right? When something's working, don't break it. But our point is it's not working for everybody, right? It's not working for a lot of people in the city, many of whom are not participating. And, they only pop up when there's a big, massive development near them that traffic becomes impossible, and they start screaming about it, and we forget how we got to that point. They forget that our general plan was not updated for 30 years. They forget that people got special favors in the zoning laws. We are dealing with a big development here that is very controversial called the Villages. It's because of decisions that were made 15 years ago, 14 years ago about zone changes. So we want to avoid that by having more participative democracy. You heard the term that, eternal vigilance, right? And eternal vigilance by an informed electorate is really what makes America work. And the beauty we have is, first generation immigrants came here because they want to succeed here, came here because they want the system to be fair, came here because they want do not have the corruption or even the appearance of corruption from where they came from. You know what I'm saying? And so we actually have a very receptive, we hope, voting base who can understand that little corruption things can lead to bigger corruption things.
Yeah.
In our city council in the past, we give this amazing example where people don't even get it. We have a property in the city that is leased to a hospitality vendor. They run kind of the venue for us. They're supposed to have parties and dining and all that, and then give some rent to the city and all that. That person, that entity holds. Our city council in 2012 gave them a lease for 60 years. 60. Now, who gives a 60-year lease to somebody? I mean, 5 years, 10 years. I've even seen 20 years, but 60-year lease, and we don't get much benefit out of this. So then you really start to say, who is this working for? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And why are those decisions being made? And then you start to see that thing I was telling you earlier, which is you get legal campaign donations, people get elected, people have business before the same people they helped elect, they get these favors. It completely short circuits the citizenry out of that process, right?
Yeah.
Because the citizenry really didn't help them get elected. Quite frankly, they only got elected by getting the big donations and sending out the slick mailers that we all voted for. We thought we were electing them, but not really. You look at our District 5, where that whole 710 has never been resolved. The traffic there on Fremont and Valley and Mission and all that area. And arguably, if they had strong local representation with a council person historically who were going to stand for those things, as opposed to getting lost in all 5 members somehow thinking that they all have a stake in it, those voters, in my view, would have had better outcomes. They would have had people little screaming from the rooftops saying, these are my people who are sitting here for 5 lights that are changing before I can go half a mile. You can't keep dumping this on me. So these are just examples. I'm saying governance, transparent governance. I use the phrase, the people's business must be done in public, right? That's what we want. And so all of these things come together, and people that are opposing it, I'm not saying I'm not saying that they don't love Alhambra any less or any more than we do. What I'm simply saying is to scare people and say that your votes are taken away without understanding the nuance of what we are saying, okay, is trying to basically gut punch people at an emotional level, saying they're taking away something. And, it's harder to explain that you really perhaps shouldn't have had that to begin with if it's a Voting Rights Act violation. But that seems to be the angle that they're coming from. I just became aware, and this is going to be timely for you, literally an hour before this podcast, that there's another group that has just sent out another negative mailer that we are just finding about.
Really?
Literally an hour or 2 ago. I hope to see it in the mail today. But again, it has named some people who are on the pro side and accused them of all kinds of things. It has I personally have been accused of donating money for signature gathering, which I told you. And I have made these are all public disclosures. They were completely disclosed as required. In fact, that happened 2 years ago in 2018 when we gathered the signatures. But I just think that while it may or may not be effective, I have no idea, but it certainly doesn't appear to be an engagement on the merits of everything that is in Measure B, and that's unfortunate in my mind.
And something that you mentioned earlier about like housing, and we might be shifting into kind of like the housing
sure.
and
Sure.
and you're part of the city planning commission, so there's been a lot of conversation. I'm pretty sure it's been kind of like an omnipresent thing in your life. So there's a lot of calls for more affordable housing, and now with in December the presidential moratorium on eviction is going to be let up in December, in the 30th. But some of the criticisms I had with Eric was that there wasn't necessarily, it was an eviction moratorium and everybody was like, oh yes, thank you and stuff like that, but there wasn't like a thinking further down the line that people still need to pay those those individuals back over time. There's no cancel rent. There's no subsidies for people that can't pay that back, and I think there's a lot of people that's going to be left on the margins. I think after December 31st, like there might be a lot of evictions happening all at once. And do you worry in some ways that there's not enough housing in the Alhambra areas for families to live, like affordable housing and units?
I completely worry. And the Planning Commission, just only a month ago, we finally got through what we call our inclusionary housing ordinance, that had been gestating for years. Okay. And we finally got that through Planning Commission. The City Council has accepted what Planning Commission did. It lays out, I think, a modest start to not just getting housing, but getting it at the right economic tiers, the medium, the low, the very low, types of housing that are important for, whether you call it workforce housing, we call it the hollowing out of the middle class, whether you call it, whatever you want to call it, it's basically housing at not just the highest economic levels, but throughout. Now, in part, Bryan, it's because we have state mandated goals. The Regional Housing Needs Assessment, RHNA, lays out goals for us that we should have enough zone capacity for housing so many units in each of those categories, and we were well short. If you look at housing, and I'm sure you got more into it with Eric, we have built a lot of housing in the last 20 years, but they've all been kind of age restricted, a lot of senior housing. Okay?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A lot of it, frankly, senior housing, but that has done nothing to families with small children. That has not done anything to, sort of the economically hard to house people. And the pandemic just came and jolted that whole thing into one extra notch. You know what I'm saying? I mean, people were hanging in, kind of probably spending 50, 60, 70. I don't know the exact numbers at some levels, a lot of their income on housing. And the pandemic just exacerbated that. Now, your question had to do with, I can't speak to national issues, but I can't see how you can, because the people who are not able to pay their rents, frankly, the group that they're not able to pay to many times is themselves small businesses, a small mom and pop renter at a house, a landlord who is barely not able to make their mortgage payment. You know what I'm saying? So it kind of moves up the chain. So I can't see how we get through this pandemic without more relief. And from the federal level coming down to us saying, you cannot squeeze blood out of a turnip, right? And these are not lazy people. They're not getting the money coming in because they're not working, for crying out loud. And if they cannot pay the rent, their landlord is going to lose that place, right? The bank is going to be sitting with foreclosures. You can avoid all that by saying, you know what? Yes, we're in a hole. We got to get out of this, but we have to subsidize these people. We have to give them that benefit, not let this sword hang on top of them that, oh yeah, we get relief right now, but come next summer, you're 12 months of back rent, Where are you going to get that from, right? It's not going to happen. It's not a practical solution. I cannot see how that is resolved without some more aid. At a local level, though, however, Bryan, let me sort of bring it down to local level. This is where I raise the point about if our city had enough financial cushion, right? If it was managed in a way that we had a decent rainy day fund, okay, that we had something, we could have done a little bit more at a local level to the very neediest of our citizens who were, we hear stories about kids in Alhambra High School who are living in families in their cars. We've heard that, right? Our house population is increasing. We see whether some of that is due to, mentally disturbed folks or even people who are down on their luck. But to the extent we could have done more, we just didn't have the capacity because we didn't have the resources. Because here again, if you look at the city's budget, so much of our money comes from sales tax, okay? It's our auto row, it's our Home Depots and so on. And that, of course, goes to the county and a small trickle comes back to us, right? We haven't encouraged development. Like, think of it this way. We raise this, Eric and I actually. We are within 5 miles of the Caltechs, the JPLs, the Huntington, high-tech universities. we have limited land, but we could have developed it for more high-paying jobs, for more things that are not retail, right? Things that are not where the tax base is more resilient, right? The tax base doesn't disappear. If we stop going to the restaurants because of pandemic, well, our sales taxes were down, right? Those folks are not paying sales taxes. So that requires thinking of a little different type. And that has not been the pattern because Alhambra has been run by real estate interests. It's been pretty simple. You have developers and real estate agents who make commissions. And I'm not saying those are not honorable people, so don't get me wrong. But the broadening of thinking that you're putting all your eggs in one basket, and when a pandemic comes, it exposes that basket for its fragility, right? And that's what we are facing with. I'm hoping that we get more input, more voices, and we broaden the debate. We'll start thinking about, we don't want to go through this again. If we have 10, 15, 20 acres, how do we deploy them to get our housing a little more in balance? How do we get some more high-paying jobs to the city so we have a tax base that is not simply dependent on me buying cars? And I don't know about you, Brian. I don't know that the car business will be the same like it is 20 years from now, right? People will be buying different cars. They might be doing something totally different for mobility. And if we have so many of our eggs in the buy cars and give us sales tax business, we have to think ahead and say that's not sustainable for the long term. But all of that comes from having more than 10 people and their cronies run the business, right? Run the city. So it all is to rejuvenate that and say, please make room for new voices because we need new ideas in the city.
Yeah, that was the one of the points that we had with Chris Olson, well, one of the candidates for the city of Alhambra, and the idea that we've had a system here in this area and in the greater San Gabriel Valley area, and this idea that tourism dollars and like we're kind of like the foodie mecca of like Asian American food, and
626, well known in Shanghai.
626, the night market, and that identity, is very important. But we've mentioned that like it's so fragile. Like no one goes into restaurant business thinking that they're going to make a lot of money. No, these are passion projects from families, and these are people's dreams to own a restaurant, and so so if there's something like an existential crisis like a pandemic, like that would destroy a family's ability to stay open during during these tough times, where what you are making before, you're making only 20%, but at least like 60 to 80%. That does not cover the rent on the land where your restaurant is standing on.
I completely agree. Our small businesses, our restaurants, our ability to help people in a pandemic. And I'm not saying that everybody could have been helped. Pandemics are unique. They come once every 100 years. I'm not going to blame people in city council saying why we didn't keep the ship completely right. But to the extent we could have helped, it was constrained because you didn't have the resources. Right? Everything was left to, gather something from this church or do something there, set up a food bank here. And people did their best, and I commend them for it. But as a way to have a more forceful response. And you know what, Brian, that's what I mean by, I know this pandemic is new and it hit us here, and boy, it's like, who could have thought, right?
Yeah.
But our Asian population who have connections to, Hong Kong and Taiwan and mainland China and even the Koreas, and this is not their first pandemic. In the last 20 years, they've had SARS, they've had the swine flu, they've had the bird flu, right? They know they've reacted in their home countries. So it's the fact that we could have seen something like that come to this country, right? Mm-hmm. and as we all remember that back in December, our Asian population was already wearing masks, right? Walking around. And we were like thinking, oh, what are they afraid of? Come on, that always happens only across the big pond. It's never going to come here, because it hadn't, right? Mm-hmm. And this time it did. But the lessons were there to be learned. The resiliencies were there. But it requires a certain amount of thinking that I'm going to think for the good of the city 10, 20, 30 years in advance, and not short term, like how can I get elected again? Who are the 5 people I can round up and have, on my behalf, and I can scratch their back, they can scratch mine, and it becomes short-term thinking and the idea that 20 years from now I'll be long gone, somebody else will be dealing with this mess that I'm going to leave them. That's what we want to change. We want a little bit more of a stakeholder. We want young people who are moving in here to be able to say that, their kids can go to play in the parkland, our schools want to be strong, this is a nice place to live, and we want to live here for 30 years, so get involved and make the place work for you. And a part of it is financial. I think if we had a rainy day fund, I truly think we could have done a little bit more for people. And now we are begging for dollars like anybody else to Sacramento or to Washington. And if something trickles down, great. If it's not, then it's friends and family, and the safety net is very fragile. I mean, I completely agree with you. But housing, we've started to, at least with inclusionary housing, I'm hoping we have some things in place now. How will they come up? Just in a couple of weeks, we will have a low-income housing project come up for vote, the one on 2nd Street. That's been there for a while. But Alhambra doesn't have a whole lot of land. So it's a matter of leveraging public dollars, private dollars, getting smart developers to create smart projects that you can at least get people, that want to have, that stability, that they can find it in Alhambra. They don't have to go to Fontana or the Inland Empire and have a 2-hour commute, right?
Yeah. And keeping the talent local. You were mentioning about having smart developers and non-smart development. So, and I know this is a very controversial conversation, but so the villages in Alhambra, and so and the conversation there. So what are some of the new updates on that? Given that it is a expensive project that is going to benefit only a certain amount of people, and what they're calling affordable housing in the project for the villages is not really affordable for the local population in the area.
Yeah, where we're at, and Bryan, I have to caution that I am on the Planning Commission, so I have to vote on this. So I cannot tell you what I'm thinking because that would be illegal. Okay. But what I can tell you is what the status is, at least. I can at least update you on where things stand. That part is factual. Yes, the project has proposed on that piece of land, which is altogether about 30 acres. However, there is an existing, as you know, offices and the LA Fitness and all that there. So in the remaining part of that land, the developer has proposed to build 1,061 units, about half of it for sale, half of it for rent. And then they proposed it on just focusing on the housing element. They said that they would set aside about 5%, if you will, of the, about 10% of the 4 rent units. Somewhere around 50 or 55 units as affordable only at the moderate category. There's a moderate, there's a low, and a very low category. The moderate is anywhere from 80% to 120% of the county's average median income. But they didn't propose anything at low and very low. So the project went through extensive public comment. We've been meeting as Planning Commission, hearing public comment for many weeks. It finally has been debated in the Planning Commission in the last Monday's meeting. And really, based on the sense of the Planning Commission, the developer has gone back and said they are going to come back with some revisions. They took input from the Planning Commission, who in turn took input from the community. Housing was an issue. I think traffic is an issue, contamination of the ground, parking, public community benefits, walkability, all kinds of issues in a project that large were discussed. And so where it stands exactly is the developer has taken all that input, and we as the Planning Commission are supposed to, and we actually have our meeting on Monday, the day before the election, on the 2nd, okay? And they will come back with some ideas for revisions to that project. And I have no idea what that will be, but it didn't look like there was, although there was not a formal vote taken, there was kind of a sense of the Planning Commission, and the project as proposed would not have passed. In other words, it would not have gotten the votes there are at least 6 votes out of 10 to pass it at the Planning Commission.
Mhm.
And because of that, I think the developer said, let's come back to you with some ideas. And so that's where we're at. I mean, literally, they will, and what that is and how that's going to be debated, I have no idea.
Yeah, and you mentioned there's multiple issues within that area. I think historically, that area wasn't necessarily a residence area. There was like historically there's some steel mills and like some industrial waste. I know you're an environmental individual, so the issue of like Superfund sites is also there too, and so there is an environmental conversation
Yeah.
to be had, because if you're, for folks that are listening to this podcast, that area of Alhambra has been factories, warehouses, not a lot of individual housing or apartments there before, but now this is a big plan to kind of like push more housing stock into the Alhambra system.
Yeah, no, I think that's accurate. If you look at the zoning history there and simply the land use history there, there was the Alhambra Foundry, the famous Alhambra Foundry was there on the west side of Fremont, basically. Still remnants of it. If you look carefully as you're driving down Fremont, or you can see remnants of the Alhambra Foundry towards the back there, sort of north and west to where the Starbucks and the little mini mall is near where Kohl's is. This particular on the east side of Fremont, this was an industrial area in the 30s and 40s. It was a factory really for building lots of heat exchangers and things. And as you know, even in that part, a greater part of that area, we really have kind of small factories and warehouses, and there's no residential stuff north of Mission and sort of south of Commonwealth in that block there. So this zoning change to allow for high residential kind of housing happened in the mid 2000s and 2006, and the developer has been, the landowner and developer has been working supposedly since that time to bring this kind of a project along with other partners. But while it is not in a housing area, traffic has been a big issue, mainly because the 710 never been completed, and so Fremont Avenue has taken the hit. And not just Fremont Avenue, a lot of the local streets get overrun with traffic because people try to find shortcuts and go through neighborhoods when they don't want to wait on Fremont. And we have that tiny little bridge that crosses the railroad tracks to go to Valley and then ultimately to the 10, basically, or the 710. So I think it raises issues, a lot of community concerns about traffic. We heard a lot of community concerns about air quality, a lot of community concerns. And you mentioned that area, groundwater in that area is part of a Superfund site. And the fact that this area was used as a factory has some implications on contamination that should be mitigated or could be mitigated. So that was another concern. Yeah, there were multiple issues in addition to the size and sort of scale of the whole thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not that we're making the case with that we're against development, and I made the conversation with Eric Sonata. It's like, it's not that we don't want development happening in the city. It's just that we need to be tactful and say, like, for whom, like, in ultimately, will this benefit the immediate population in this area? Is it gonna continue the idea of gentrification in the city of Alhambra? Are generations of families having to move further for work and outside the city limits? And to some degree, there can be a case to be made of, like, people like to joke around, conservatives like to say the exodus of the California exodus. There's something to be said about that, because people are moving away because the pure fact that housing is a big issue. And just for the people understand, a Superfund site is basically federal dollars allocated towards areas where historically pollution has been an issue. So if it's groundwater, air, or chemical pollution, like I think it's federal dollars set away for to make sure that these areas
Well,
are
let
clean,
me clarify that for you. It's right with the following additional twist, which is, so a Superfund site gets designated because of contamination. Fundamentally, that's what's happened. And we have groundwater contamination there, which makes us the Superfund site. It's part of a bigger San Gabriel Valley Superfund site, but that area 3, all of us in Alhambra, and that particular part, that's part of that same big Superfund site. The federal government tries to find the parties responsible for that contamination,
Right.
and tries to get the dollars for cleanup from them. Well, in this case, there were a lot of small and mom and pops who contaminated that going back to the 50s and 60s. And whatever dollars the federal government was able to raise from them, even if those people exist now, was not enough. That's where the additional federal dollars come in. And federal dollars are scarce. That's why that process drags on. So that place, we've been a Superfund site for some years, and we will continue to be, because the cleanup base depends on the federal budget and finding, by the time it all trickles down to EPA, and they've got 1,000 Superfund sites in the country, and by the time it comes down to our neck of the woods, it's not enough to do everything and complete it in within 3 months, 6 months, 3 years even. So that's why the pace is a little more leisurely than would anybody would like to, agree. And it's not, and it's because that people who contaminated that are not, frankly, around anymore. And our tax dollars are paying for it through the federal government. And but the contamination is there, and the contamination has to be dealt with properly in a health protective way. I mean, housing is important, but nobody should be faced with making the choice between, do I have a house, or do I have a house in a contaminated piece of land where I can be sick or my family can be sick? That's a false choice, right? I mean, when we want housing, we're not saying, well, give me any housing, no matter how bad it can hurt my health. I mean, people have a reasonable expectation that they won't get sick from the house that they live in. So that is the issue. And so that contamination in that area adds another twist, if you will, to the traffic and density and other challenges for that project of that size in that area. Yeah.
So that being said, ultimately, so outside of the village's conversation, like as somebody that's been involved with Grassroots Alhambra, and the call for getting more affordable housing, keeping the community, in the community, right? Like not forcing people to be moving out of Alhambra. What do you see? What is your magic wand moment that you would want to see Alhambra take on to address the issue of housing? And what would your ideal view of Alhambra be in terms of housing?
Well, I have an ideal view, but I have no illusions that it will take time to get to that ideal point. In other words, there is not a snap your fingers and things change quickly option, unfortunately. But the ideal view is to make the city work for its citizens. And I know I keep coming back to that theme, because with affordable housing, it actually means different things to different people. The first step I see is clearing up misconceptions. There are people in our city, when we talk to affordable housing, they think this is like the Chicago 60s style barracks that are a hotbed of crime and criminality, and you're just going to bring, quote unquote, the wrong people to my part of town. There is a lot of sort of resistance to why are these people coming, or who's going to live here next to me, what, will just this fear of the other, fear of the unknown, fear of we faced that not close to where I live here in a nice part of town, when the old police department was being converted to a probation office. People said, oh my gosh, there's going to be just crime's just going to go through the roof here, and it hasn't. I mean, it's a probation office. People come, go, they deal with their jobs. So a lot of it is, I think some of it is educating our community that it is good for us not to have people who have nice, well-maintained single-family houses and a whole bunch of renter population where they don't have as much of a stake in the city. We do need housing at all income levels, even to the maximum extent we can do it, because that increases the roots that we put into our city. You know what I'm saying? That it is good for the city's, fares. That's educational process. But in terms of practically getting it, I have an all of the above strategy. Every opportunity that comes in front of us, that's what the inclusionary housing ordinance says. Anybody that wants to build 5 units or more has to do something. They have to do their part. Okay, whether you have a fraction that is dedicated on your own development, whether you put into a fund that the city can aggregate and buy a piece of land and give it to a housing developer who builds that kind of stuff. We want every possible option to be on the books. Where I think also one opportunity that we haven't fully exploited is a lot of our housing stock, particularly rental housing stock, is now 50 or 60 years old. Okay, they were built in the 70s, they're built in the 80s, and they're getting old. And I think there will be some rejuvenation of that. In other words, there will be some turnover of that because those structures are getting old. They're not going to have that much life left out of them. And I think that's an opportunity for us actually with proper planning to integrate that kind of housing. And we don't want affordable housing meaning, oh, that's the 40 unit thing in this part of town where only the bad people live. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
it has to be dispersed throughout. It has to be dispersed throughout where, so we will have this turnover, I think, in the next decade. We will have the opportunity to, even if it is 1 unit out of 8, 1 unit out of 6, in lieu fund, and you get something there. It will be that process that gets us that middle and low income housing affordability into our city, but throughout the city, not in one corner somewhere. And for that, I think we are setting the stage. We have a zoning amendment coming our way at the Planning Commission pretty soon to make this type of stuff consistent with our general plan and to bring in. I don't see a silver bullet, but I do see a lot of little silver nickels and dimes where we can try to bring it with every opportunity. I just think that it is a pipe dream to say that we can overnight fix the problem. I don't think we can, but it's going to be a, what do you call that old proverb? It's going to be a marathon, not a sprint on that one.
Yeah.
Every opportunity, every developer has to do it. We constantly get in the Planning Commission somebody who's wanted to developing 8 or 10 units saying, I'm too small. Please don't do this to me. Deal with it to the next guy. The problem is we'll run out of next guys. Everybody has to do their part, right? Even if it's a small part, it's the small parts that will add up to something significant, not just 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and somebody will suddenly save us. Okay, I don't think that's going to work. That's just my personal view.
Yeah, it's like calling for like realistic. I wouldn't say just incremental change, but change in the way that can be possible to see. Not I wouldn't say kind of immediate, like the 5 to 10 year changes, right?
Yeah, it's definitely not incremental, but it is what I call every opportunity. In other words, you look at that for literally every opportunity. You don't simply set aside an opportunity and say, no, that can't work. You explore it, whether that can play a role, that can contribute. That's what I mean.
So I don't know if you have enough time, but I did want to talk about one last topic, which was the culture of Alhambra and the areas and kind of the enclaves that I feel like I've been ignorant of. And one of the things that bridged our paths together was I think in 2018 2019 the risk of the Gurdwara in Alhambra, and I know the Planning Commission had several things happen, and with that, the developer wanted just to knock it down and then build commercial spaces. I remember.
No, it's going to be a set of condominiums he wants to build. Actually, residential condominiums.
Oh, residential, and I felt guilty because I never realized there was like a big South Asian connection with the city of Alhambra, and I was like, oh, wait a minute, that does kind of make sense, of like the immigration of like the 80s and the 70s and the 90s, where many South Asian individuals came to the U.S. So I just wanted to know, as someone that's like kind of like a pseudo community member in the San Gabriel Valley, what ended up happening with those projects? Was there a deal? Like I know that the Gurdwara is still standing, but the
Gurdwara is physically still there. What happened from the planning process is ultimately the developer's right to affirm and move forward on his plans could not be overturned. In other words, he had a legal right. He had gone through the process. There was some back and forth about whether the project was properly noticed or not. As if you recall, there was a lot of that. It is not just, the Gurudwara was kind of unique because it is not just Alhambra residents. That was kind of a regional place of worship for the Sikhs in kind of the greater Sangirbil area. You know, the next closest big Gurudwara for them is off the 60 freeway close as you get closer to Diamond Bar. Okay.
Yeah, I think I remember seeing that.
Yeah, there's a big Gurudwara to the south side if you drive on the 60 as you're heading towards the the 60 and the 57 interchange a little bit before that. So a lot of people, like 300-400 people, Sikhs who worship there, they came from all over the place, and it's been one of the oldest ones in this area actually. On the other hand, it was leased, so they didn't own the land. The landlord had supposedly told them that he was going to develop this at some point, and he decided it was going to be that. And so I don't know the details of what deal they've struck with the landlord, but I know that his project was ultimately approved. In other words, his project to build his condominiums. Now, nothing has happened, and that may be the pandemic. It may be something else, Brian. I have no idea what the status of it. I do bump into the Sikh community. I'm from India. I mean, a lot of the Sikh folks are from India. There used to be a Punjab grocery store on Main Street, which has now moved just into San Gabriel, just maybe a few blocks east, still on Las Tunas, just beyond Mission. So what I hear is they were looking for an alternate place in Rosemead that might work, or another place. I know there was talk about the developer perhaps helping them with some relocation assistance. I'd also heard that there was some lawsuits that may have been filed. So I'm not privy to the day-to-day what exactly is the current status. Yeah. All I know is there were some big important lessons learned for us though in Alhambra, and that is an important part. One of them is it did completely change in the way we notice projects in Alhambra.
Right.
So we have a revamped system where projects are noticed. You kind of see them, what I call that, like the Caltrans style boards, that we put them that something's going to happen here. So not only the community, but also the passerbys who can see that they can participate in that process, and not be caught surprised saying, oops, I had no idea, that there was a meeting. So we notice projects much better as a result of that. We also expect, as a result of that project, candid testimony in front of the Planning Commission. There was some back and forth whether people were being honest and truthful or not. We don't put people on oath on the Bible or anything like that when they provide testimony, but we wanted people to be aware that they need to provide full and honest testimony, complete testimony. So there were some important structural changes, particularly on noticing how projects get noticed as a result of that. I hope the Gurudwara stays in the immediate vicinity because a lot of people worship, and they're a great community resource. What people don't realize is, we talk about homeless, they serve free meals every Saturday. They've been doing that for decades, okay? And literally to anybody who walks in, you and I could walk in, we get a welcome, we get a nice, wonderful, healthy Indian meal for free, okay? That community is all about service. I mean, the Sikh community prides itself on community service. They get mistaken for being Muslim terrorists and all kinds of weird things because of the way they wear their turbans, which is highly unfortunate. They're a really wonderful group of people, and they do great community service. And yeah, even tomorrow, or rather day after tomorrow, if I feel like at lunchtime I need to just go grab a meal, I can literally walk in there. There's no bar, and they deliver meals to the homeless here. So I think. But they're a hidden, kind of under the radar thing, so nobody knew much about them. I'm glad they got publicity. I'm glad the good works they do came up to the public consciousness, frankly.
And then given the pandemic, it's like, it is an essential service now that places like these exist that can serve the community meals, and
Exactly.
And so I just want to leave off with just kind of one final question or sentiment, is like, what do you see the future of Alhambra given a situation like a pandemic like this, and then that pandemic leading off into this sort of depression or recession? Do you feel optimistic about what's going to be happening in the next? Because this is something that I've talked to Chris Olson about, is that just because we're wearing masks now and then we're trying to get ready for a treatment and vaccine doesn't mean that once we get those things that the pandemic is over. There are going to be ramifications and things that we're gonna still see like 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line. Like if we're thinking about '08, the reason why we don't have certain services in schools, there's reasons why there's cut stuff because the housing market and all of those things happen in '08. So do you feel confident in the city? So I wouldn't say surviving, but like what do you see Alhambra's position is after 10 years after COVID?
If we do the right things, Bryan, we will come out of the pandemic stronger than before in many ways. Because pandemics, number one, are life-altering, and they're generational. Anybody who thinks that pandemics will just, after one or two things happen, will go back to normal is kidding themselves. The pandemic flu in this country in 1918 had ramifications all the way 50 years after that, okay? The whole generation that it hit, whether it's how people save, whether it's how people take personal responsibility, whether it's how people become more aware of what's around them, things they're taken for granted, okay? They suddenly become aware of, oh my gosh, my life depends on a lot more than what I thought it did. Pandemics have into our subconscious, it has seeped in, okay? And it's not going away. So I don't think that there is a return to whatever the past was. I can't tell you whether we'll be wearing masks for 6 months. I personally think we'll be wearing masks for a long time, okay? I personally think we're never going back to shaking hands with people as a greeting for a long time, So pandemics will be altering. So that is not up to us. What is up to us is how we recognize the lessons learned, the strengthening of the sort of social fabric, and how we build structures to deal with that. In that sense, pandemics can be opportunities. That's the way I see it. In other words, they have just exposed what was always there. They have just exposed the weaknesses that we were kind of papering over, right? And now, I think that will become an opportunity if we can say, yes. I'll give you an example that maybe is not popular, and we're seeing it in cities, Bryan, but I don't know the ramification. We talk about high-density housing, but I don't know that people have a lot of stomach to going back and living in very cramped, stacked housing right now. People actually like the idea of a little more separation, right? Right. Are they going to live on top of each other? I mean, that will affect housing. That will affect the very things we're talking about, density and, inclusionary housing. So those things are not clear how and what lessons will be learned. I don't think we're going to get a vaccine that's going to be good forever. I think it's going to be more like the flu vaccine. You get it, it's good for 2-3 months. You got to take it all over again, right? Because that's why every year you take the flu vaccine. It's not that you get it once like you get it from measles at childhood and it gives you immunity for the rest of your life. So this coronavirus is trickier than that. So I think we'll have a period of time when we have to draw lessons. It really exposes. I like pandemics because what I've seen is I'm an optimist. I like it that it is imposing on us a sense that we owe it to other people to be responsible ourselves, right? This act of even wearing a mask, that you're doing it for yourself, but you're really doing it for others, okay? I think a lot of, when we don't have to, we become kind of a little selfish. We think the world is made for us. We think, we were born on, we are on third base and because, we hit the triple, and not that we were just born there, So we have a tendency to think that when good things happen to us, it's because we did it. And when bad things happen to us, it's because the other guy's fault, right? We get into that mindset, which is, I think, going to be different because we think that it is, I know it sounds like a cliche because you see it everywhere. We're all in this together. Well, part of it is true. We are, because we are not, we still breathe the air that everybody else breathes into and out. But how we strengthen ultimately people who are likely to be left behind is going to be a test of our city. At the same time, we will demand, I think, personal responsibility from people who can do more, and they should do more and take care of themselves. My wife's a nurse. I mean, she tells me every day, if you can't take care of yourself first, you can't take care of others, right? You can't. If you're going to be sick yourself, you can't take care of people who are sick. So I think it will be all those things. I think it's an opportunity. I think we'll come out of this a better city, at least with a better awareness of all the things that are possible in our city. But that does mean we have to change leadership, or at least allow more voices into leadership. And that's, Grassroots is really, in that sense, there are a lot of great organizations who are focused on housing, who are focused on social justice, who are focused on a lot of things. Ours is even more fundamental, which is we want transparency in government, right?
Right.
But all these other things can happen. You know what I'm saying? If you have transparency in government and clean, non-corrupt government, then all these other good ideas by other far more smart people can actually be debated and thoughtful decisions can be made. That's what we're trying to do.
Well, thank you. So if you enjoyed what you just saw today,
it was great, Brian.
Yeah.
Thanks for the nice back and forth. You've obviously done your research, and you had great questions. And I hope it was useful to you too, and to your listeners. If any of your listeners haven't voted and they're still, there's time, please vote for Measure V.
Yeah, please check it out. Please check out all the ballot measures and things that come into the mail-in ballot, or if you're going to be voting in person, please be careful. But whatever you see in your ballot at your polling location, just be aware of the things that you'll be voting for. And if you enjoyed what you saw today, please consider subscribing. And then I guess we'll see you on the next podcast.
Thank you, Brian. Good talking to you.